Marigold Hastings had worked the morning shift at the Blue Sparrow Diner for 9 years, and in that time, she had perfected the art of being exactly what people needed her to be without ever letting them see what she needed herself. She refilled coffee cups before they were empty. She remembered that the man in booth 4 liked his eggs over medium, not over easy, a distinction he had never once had to explain twice. She smiled at every customer who walked through the door, a warm, practiced smile that arrived a half-second before her eyes did, the way a smile does when it has been worn so many times it no longer requires thought. She was 42 years old. With soft auburn hair she kept pinned back in a low knot, and a slim frame that carried trays of hot plates with an ease that made the work look effortless, even on the mornings when her feet ached before her shift had even started. The regulars loved her. They just didn't know her, not really. Not in the way people know someone whose life they've actually asked about. Nobody at the Blue Sparrow knew that. Marigold's husband had left 8 months earlier, taking the good car and most of the savings, and leaving behind a mortgage she was 2 payments behind on. Nobody knew she picked up a second job 3 nights a week cleaning offices downtown, or that she often skipped her own lunch so she could put the tip money toward her son's inhaler prescription instead. Nobody asked because nobody thought to, because Marigold had built her entire presence around the idea that a waitress's job was to be useful and pleasant and, above all, unremarkable in her own struggles. She poured herself into everyone else's cup and quietly went without. It was a Tuesday morning in April when Odette Marchetti walked into the diner holding her father's hand, a small girl of 6 with dark curly hair and 2 uneven pigtails, wearing a yellow raincoat despite the clear sky outside, because she had insisted on wearing it and her father, tired and running late, hadn't had the energy to argue. Her father, Desmond Marchetti, was a contractor who stopped at the Blue Sparrow most Tuesdays before a job site nearby, always ordering the same thing, always in a hurry, always half looking at his phone while his daughter looked at everything else. Odette had the particular gift some children have of noticing what adults have trained themselves not to see. She watched people the way other children watched cartoons, completely, without distraction, without the polite social instinct to look away. Marigold approached their booth with her usual warmth, notepad in hand. "Morning, you two." The usual Desmond. "Please, thank you, Mari." He didn't look up from his phone. Odette, however, was staring at Marigold's hands as she wrote down the order. Marigold's knuckles were red and slightly cracked, the kind of raw redness that comes from too much hot water and not enough lotion, from scrubbing office floors 3 nights a week after an 8-hour diner shift. There was a small bandage on her thumb, half peeled at the edge, and beneath her eyes, carefully powdered over but not quite hidden, was the particular gray shadow of someone who hadn't slept properly in longer than she could remember. "Why do your hands look like that?" Odette asked. The question landed in the booth the way a dropped plate lands in a quiet room, and small, sudden, and impossible to ignore. Desmond looked up from his phone, embarrassed, already opening his mouth to correct his daughter. But Marigold, notepad still in hand, only smiled, the same practiced smile, and said, "Just from working, sweetheart, comes with the job." "But you look so tired," Odette said, undeterred, tilting her head with the guileless persistence only children possess. "Are you sad?" "Odette," Desmond said gently, "that's not something we ask people." "It's all right," Marigold said quickly, though something in her voice had shifted just slightly, like a hairline crack forming beneath a surface that had held for a very long time. "I'm okay, honey. I'm just a little tired today." But Odette wasn't finished. She had the diner's full attention now. In the particular way a child's, unfiltered question always seems to widen a room's silence, rather than shrink it. A few nearby regulars, the ones who had sat in Marigold's section for years without truly seeing her, found themselves listening. "My mommy gets tired like that too," Odette said, quieter now, almost to herself. "When she's sad and doesn't want anyone to know." Marigold's hand, still holding the notepad, went still. For 9 years, she had perfected the skill of deflecting concern, of turning attention away from herself and back onto the comfort of others. But a 6-year-old in a yellow raincoat had just done, in 14 words, what no adult customer had managed in nearly a decade. She had seen through the performance entirely, not with judgment but with simple, uncomplicated compassion. "I'll get your coffee," Marigold said softly, and walked quickly to the counter, where she stood for a moment longer than necessary, blinking hard before returning to her rounds. Desmond apologized quietly when she came back with the coffee. "I'm sorry," she says, whatever's on her mind. "I should have—" "Don't apologize," Marigold said, and meant it more than the automatic politeness of the word suggested. She wasn't wrong. That should have been the end of it. An uncomfortable moment smoothed over, forgotten by lunch. But Odette, it turned out, was not a child who let things go easily. When their food arrived, she watched Marigold move between tables, watched her rub at her lower back when she thought no one was looking, watched her count out change from her own apron, pocket to cover a regular's forgotten wallet without a second thought. By the time they finished eating, Odette had built in her small, uncomplicated mind a complete and accurate picture of a woman who gave everything to everyone and kept nothing for herself. As they got up to leave, Odette tugged her father's sleeve and whispered something. Desmond hesitated, then nodded and pulled out his wallet. When Marigold cleared their table, she found, tucked under the coffee mug, not the usual few dollars, but $60 in cash, along with a paper napkin with careful, uneven 6-year-old handwriting that read, "For being tired and still nice," from Odette. Marigold stood at the empty booth holding the napkin for a long moment. The kind of moment that, in a busy diner, usually gets swallowed by the next order, the next table, the next demand on her attention. But this time something in her simply stopped. She folded the napkin carefully and put it in her apron pocket next to her heart, and finished her shift with an ache in her chest she couldn't quite name. What Marigold didn't know was that Odette's question, and her father's quiet, embarrassed apology, had been overheard by more than one table that morning, including Priscilla Vance, a regular who came in every Tuesday, sat alone with the newspaper and had for years, tipped generously, but never once asked Marigold how she was doing. Priscilla had watched the entire exchange over the top of her reading glasses, and something about a child's plain, unpolished honesty had cut through years of comfortable inattention. The following week, Priscilla returned, and instead of ordering and burying herself in the newspaper as usual, she asked Marigold directly, "How are you really doing, Mari?" Not the polite answer, the real one. Marigold, caught off guard for the second time in 2 weeks, found herself, for the first time in 8 months, telling someone the truth about the divorce, about the second job, about the mortgage payments, stacking up quietly behind a smile she wore for 8 hours a day. Priscilla listened without interrupting, and when Marigold finished, embarrassed at how much she'd said, Priscilla simply said, "I run the community outreach board at my church. We have a fund for exactly this. Let me help." It wasn't a single dramatic rescue. It was smaller and slower than that and more real for it. Priscilla connected Marigold with a small emergency assistance fund that covered her overdue mortgage payments. A regular who worked in HR at a local hospital mentioned an opening for a billing coordinator, daytime hours, benefits included, and helped Marigold polish a resume she hadn't updated in a decade. Within 2 months, Marigold had given her notice at the cleaning company, kept her mornings at the Blue Sparrow because she genuinely loved the regulars, and started her new position, with hours that let her be home when her son got out of school. Desmond and Odette kept coming in every Tuesday. Odette, now 7, still watched people carefully, still asked the questions adults had learned not to ask, and Marigold had come to look forward to those mornings, the way she once dreaded any attention drawn to herself. One Tuesday, nearly a year after, the yellow raincoat and the $60 in the napkin folded against her heart, Marigold knelt down beside the booth as she refilled Desmond's coffee and looked at Odette directly. "You know," she said, "you asked me something once that nobody else ever had the courage to ask." "Was it a bad question?" Odette asked, suddenly uncertain, the way children sometimes are when reminded of their own boldness. "No, sweetheart," Marigold smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, before her mouth had even finished forming the shape of it. "It was the best question anyone ever asked me. It's the reason things got better." Odette considered this with the serious concentration of a 7-year-old, weighing something important. "I still notice things," she said. "My mommy says I always will." "Good," Marigold said, standing, smoothing her apron, the napkin long since replaced in her memory by an entire year of small, accumulating kindnesses that had started with one child's simple, unguarded question. Don't ever stop. She still keeps that first napkin, worn soft now at the folds, tucked in a drawer at home. Not because she needs the $60 anymore, but because it reminds her of something she had forgotten in 9 years of pouring coffee for people who never thought to ask if her own cup was empty. That sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones too young to have learned to look away,